All right, this is a video that's kind of grow out of some of the comments and some of the issues that were brought up in my latest video about the political implications of race realism. I don't want to rehash that whole debate, um, but one thing that the race realists, and again, you can't please people on this topic. Like I have some commenters coming saying that I'm a racist, that I'm a bad person. You've got the identity politic people on the right, on the left who anyone who's not politically correct, anyone who doesn't believe in their type of socialism or their type of government, that they're all, right wingers. And then on the other hand, you have, the self-identified white nationalists, race realists, who they are not all one category. They have different ideas, that's for sure. But the ones that are most acrimonious against me, um, have views that I think that are I don't disagree with them necessarily when it comes to what the races are like, or ethnobiology, or evolution, or any of those things. I've made that very clear. I'm not an egalitarian. I don't think it's difficult to imagine that there are differences between different groups of people. I sometimes wonder how valid the term race is, how precise it is. But yes, there's definitely different haplogroups, all that kind of stuff. And beyond that, many of the differences that people assert, I think, are probably valid or have some level of truth. And there's probably other differences that we haven't identified yet. So in that sense, I would definitely fall into the category of a race realist. Where the problem does come in is the political implications of those, the ramifications of those. And that's, we can debate, and we definitely can debate, what are the differences between the races, absolutely, and or how valid those terms even are. We definitely can have a debate about that. I think it's none of my conclusions, though, are really going to be affected by the conclusions we reach in that debate. They're quite independent of the content of those revelations. So I can concede a whole lot and still come to the same conclusions that I am coming to now. So one issue that was brought up repeatedly, and I think was kind of seen as this is one of the major cruxes or bases for the political implications that race realists have. And again, they don't all have the same. There are race realists who are anarcho-capitalists. There are race realists who are white nationalists. There are probably some, I don't see any on my comments, who are more neocons. Like the problem though that arises is I don't think that the conclusions that they're drawing, or the political um, positions that they're taking, are implied or necessitated, or certainly not justified by the facts as they put forth. So, one a couple, and I think the reason I'm making this video is not just about race realism, because I think that the problem that they have, the fallaciousness of their conclusions, are actually quite similar to many other different arguments for government. Many other justifications for government are based on some kind of insight, and oftentimes that insight is incorrect. So, like, if you're advocating for government based on Marxist understanding of society, and you're reaching conclusions, you're making prescriptive ideas about what government ought to do based on Marxist class theory, okay, that's going to be very faulty, because Marxist class theory, for whatever merits it may have, and I'm not here to say that it doesn't have any, clearly has some flaws. I mean, there were socialists in the late 1800s who realized, look, the poor are not getting poorer, the working classes are not getting worse and worse conditions, they're getting better and better. This is contra the predictions of Marx, very explicit predictions of Marx. Obviously, he missed something, and I think with 100 years more of information, that's even clearer. But even when the insights are not totally invalid, or more valid, which I think could arguably be the case with race realism, at least depends on what we're talking about, since that itself is a pretty broad topic. It doesn't necessarily follow the prescriptions for government, or for a particular type of government, or for a particular government policy necessarily follow from that, and that's very common. You have a lot of even progressives will say, well, poverty is a problem. There are wealth disparities, and so they'll come up with all these programs. And the thing is, programs that they advocate aren't necessarily justified by the facts that may in fact be correct, that may actually be true facts. And I think this is definitely the case when we're talking about race realism. So a lot of people say, well, there are differences between the races. Well, that fact alone does not indicate the efficacy of government. to say that races are different. In fact, if the libertarian critique of government is valid, or substantially valid, even if it's not 100% valid, then it's very hard to see how government would be something that could be advocated, accepting the realities of race realism. If we think that government is a poor institution for solving problems, then why would it be a good institution for solving problems related to race? Doesn't quite follow. There's a couple steps that aren't filled there. So I think that there are two broad reasons why justifications for the state based on what may actually be valid facts fail. And broadly speaking, one of them is the knowledge problem, and the other one is that they fail to account for the characteristics of the institution, in this case, government, that they're advocating. Like, for instance, the knowledge problem in the case of the race realists. Times of Freedom made a point that, well, maybe it's like, yes, you want to interact with people, you want to have freedom of association, and maybe if you set up low-income housing, these racially inferior blacks will, or at least racially different, I don't know if he attaches, an ethical dimension to that or not, will move in, and it will be good for the renter. He's renting this low-income housing to these people, but then it's a negative. It's bad for everybody else, and so it's a negative externality. Black people are a negative externality, and I think that is, within the confines of that example, is extremely simplistic. Think about the people who run the liquor stores. Think about the people who run the lotteries. Think about the people who like to watch basketball. Think about the people who want low-income laborers. Think about the people who maybe like to associate with black people. There are people who like to associate with black people. There are people who crave to be with black people, even though that they're white. There are women who like to be with black guys. There are men who like to be with black guys. There are other, and the thing is, well, maybe they raise crime, maybe they have higher time preference. That may be true, and you can say those are negative externalities, but pretty much everybody produces negative externalities. Everybody produces waste. Everybody takes up space and reduces its availability, so therefore. It's not just black people who increase crime. Males increase crime. The highest correlating factor that I'm aware of, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, between what kind of humans are most likely to commit crimes is if they are male, regardless of their race. So does that mean that there should be some kind of government is justified to prevent the propagation of males because males have a high incidence of becoming criminals or being in accidents or whatever else when they're, and the other kind of element of that is age. It's, if you look at the statistics, and this is historically true for as long as we've had statistics, it's certain age groups, and yes, certain races more than others, but certain age groups especially, that cause the most crime. The time preference of people, very young children have the very highest time preference. It stays pretty high, it slowly starts to low, it's still pretty high, and then mid-20s, late 30s, into the 30s is when it actually starts to drop quite a bit. Now, when you're a 7-year-old child, the fact that you have high time preference isn't going to really hurt anybody because there's not a whole lot you can do. Once you go through adolescence and you start to become more of an adult, you get the physical abilities of an adult, but you still have that high time preference. Your chances, the proclivity that you'll engage in criminal acts goes up a lot. And so you could go around and say everyone who has a kid, that's going to be a negative externality, but it's also going to be a positive externality. And there's no, the calculus on what the net effect is astronomically difficult, even in very simple scenarios. And so to reach very definite cost-benefit analysis conclusions based on, well, it's good for the renter, but it's bad for everybody else, that's just an unjustifiable conclusion to reach with the calculation, with the variables that are put forth. It's very similar. I just heard David Friedman talk about this back when overpopulation, and this is still true, but less so. Overpopulation was considered this huge problem, and then a lot of the overpopulationists were saying things to the effect that it's a crime against others. It's a negative externality to have children at all, regardless of their racial admixture. And Friedman tried to do a calculation of well, how much of an inhibition is one child? How much is that hurting everybody else? And there's just so many variables that even simplifying many of the variables, you still can't figure it out. And the problem, like if we're talking about, and this is another issue that I don't understand, because it's very detrimental to take aggregates and then that are very general, even if they reflect valid information and real things, and then to take those aggregate generalizations and then come to very, very specific policies regarding how people should interact, individual people should interact, and there's more of this. People say, oh, you get along better when you're with your same race. Well, what's the threshold of getting around? Like, is it okay? Do black people have to live on another continent with an ocean between them, or is a very large river big enough, or a certain number of miles? If we have separate neighborhoods, there's no, withheld in that statement, there isn't much information that's going to tell you, like, well, is a particular interaction actually breaching that that barrier or not? Is it, if you are engaged in, if you're having an internet conversation, or you're engaged in long distance trade, or if you're occasionally meeting at, say, a music festival, or you're going on vacation, what if the political implications of race realism are going to be government, if they're going to be something more substantial than the freedom of association and the market, all right, then they're going to need to have a better justification. You're going to need to justify a coercive state, or a coercive institution anyway, if you don't want to call it a state. Okay, well, to do that, to rise to the level where you can prescribe that we're going to stop you, and we have a strong enough reason to do this, then you need to have a strong enough reason. If people are going to interact voluntarily, you don't need a great reason. You don't need a really convincing argument to allow that to happen. If you're going to prevent it from happening, then you do need a stronger reason. All right? And that's not what I see happening. And it's not just with the race realists, it's with pretty much everybody who argues in favor of government. They're not coming forward with a strong enough reason. And again, the knowledge problem, it's very, like, what degree of interaction is justifiable, what degree of interaction is not justifiable, what would be, how tortious, how criminal would be, like, if you, I suppose it would be worse if you opened up a huge apartment complex and said, I'm only going to bring blacks in here, and you import tens of thousands of blacks. That would probably be a little bit worse than if you go on a date with one black person, or you go and visit one black person, or if you play World of Warcraft against a black opponent in another continent. But all of those are degrees of association, and I don't see anything in the fact of the difference that tells you which degree is okay, which degree is not okay, what the prescriptive punishment should be for any of these amounts of interaction. If you're going to say, well, we just think it's a bad idea, and we're going to try and persuade people not to do it, and maybe we'll say it's not a good idea, or maybe an insurance company will charge you a higher rate if you have a black spouse, or if you have black employees, maybe they'll charge you higher insurance, based on statistics or whatever. Yeah, that, I don't really have a problem with, but the political implications in that are, you're still talking about anarcho-capitalism. If you're going to come and say it's going to be a crime, and if you're going to come and say, this justifies a state, then that's what you're talking about. You're talking about criminalizing these behaviors. You need to have some kind of way to do that isn't totally arbitrary, and that also is maximizing outcomes. It's just silly to say you can't have any. There are some differences. Okay, fair enough. Hence, what? No interaction at all will be the death penalty for anybody who even indicates a willingness to even interact with a person from a lesser race, or will it be just a tiny fine, or what will it be? None of that is really evident in the facts. The other problem is it makes a big difference what the degree is. Like if it's going to be execution or if it's going to be jail time. That's going to be those have huge consequences in terms of their effects, and I don't see any attempt to kind of calculate all that out and just I don't like X, hence a state is justified to somehow curtail X. It's not that simple. For any issue, we could talk about race realism, we could be talking about poverty, we could be talking about war, we could talk about pollution, we could any of the things that we could talk about. This critique would apply, and I don't see that being. I never saw that answered anywhere, And the people who are just, oh, you're just being highfalutin and theoretical. You need to have a theory of how it's going to work. You can't just. And here's the other kind of problem. The other problem is the nature of the institution of government. You can't assume that government is going to have certain attributes without being able to indicate that it's actually going to behave that way or how it actually could. It's one of the most common fallacies that people have, but they imagine some kind of idealized government. In the case of a race realist, perhaps it's a government that mitigates interactions with or influenced by less desirable races or whatever. From a progressive, it's a totally altruistic, egalitarianizing entity that goes around trying to make everybody the same in terms of their outcomes, that has no self-interest whatsoever. From the more right-wing, it's probably a more militaristic state that fights wars in the way that they prescribe. And it's very interesting because the way right-wingers advocate war, the U.S. government does not fight wars in those ways. They still support the wars generally, but the government's not fighting a war in a way that they would, in their armchair directory, actually indicate as a good way to do it. And this is very, very common where you assume it's going to be a certain way. And now, if you're assuming it's a certain way, but that certain way is pretty close to what we have, or there's a pretty reasonable expectation that it could be that way, okay, fine, you can make that argument, and that's great. But if you're just going to assert that it's going to be a certain way, especially if that's a way that has never been, or there's strong incentive reasons to assume it likely could never be. For instance, the idea that, well, if we just got corporate influence out of it, if it was just about democracy and there was no lobbying, there's never been a government like that. So how you could predicate, well, it would be fine if we did that. You need to come up with a very strong argument right off the bat on how you're going to make that possible. And I had another person commenting on another video unrelated to race realism, just like, listen, you're just critiquing this government, but we could have, we've all heard this a million times, if we just had to follow the Constitution, if we just followed those certain rules, there wouldn't be a problem and everything would be fine. And okay, theoretically that doesn't make sense to me, but it's not that simple. It's never worked that way. It's never worked that way anywhere. If we're going to proceed with this line of argument, you need to demonstrate, at least in a convincing way, and maybe not necessarily in a way that proves it beyond any possible doubt, that you can have that a constitution is going to restrain the government, or the government is going to restrain itself in some way. And I don't see that happening. That's just it's an assertion that's put out there, and then felt that no further justification is required, and I don't think that's the case. It's very frustrating when people kind of will project this ideal state, and he even made the point, a lot of the race realists are look, these immigrant populations, they're not as libertarian, and so we need to restrict immigration and stop them from coming in because they're not very libertarian, and a white nationalist race realist state would be more libertarian because it would stop. Why would the state ever want a more libertarian populace? We have a state right now, and if these people are indeed less libertarian, then that is a strong incentive for the state to bring them in. Again, that's the race realist projecting onto the government that it's altruistic, basically, that it will put race realist considerations before its own considerations. Which how can you believe that? Especially these ex-libertarians. How can you assert, oh, these are going to be the government that I'm envisioning, if indeed they are envisioning a government, and not all race realists do, so I'm not asserting that. But if you're going to envision a government, how can you assume that it's going to be motivated primarily by the subsidy and the promotion of race realist goals and not its own incentives? how? Like, you can't just imagine. Well, you can't just assert it's justified because it's going to act this way. It's going to have its own. If indeed, if we accept the premise, and I don't think it's a totally fallacious premise, by the way, that certain populations are more prone to libertarianism. Why would the government want to encourage those people? Those are people who are going to be much less receptive to government rule. Why would they not want to encourage the importation, the increase of a population that is more receptive to government rule? They have every incentive to do that, regardless of their pretensions, as race realists, for instance. So again, and it's similar like welfare. You can't assume that, well, it's just that simple. The government will make everybody, rich again. It will redistribute and give money. Well, but then those people are going to act, adjust their behavior accordingly. They're going to say, oh, there's a subsidy if you don't have an income. There's going to be a subsidy if you're a single mother. There's going to be some subsidy if you have children out of wedlock. There's going to be a subsidy if you don't have education. There's going to be a subsidy if you're unemployed. Well, what do you think is going to happen? And then from the government's point of view, the more it fails, the more that these problems persist, the more justification it has as a potential remedy, as the only remedy. I mean, it's conditioned people to the point where it seems as axiomatic that if there is a social problem, it is the government's role to fix it. That's what I was indoctrinated to believe. That was, as a kid, if every problem, and I was a very socially conscious person, and the environment and pollution and overpopulation. I used to think that everyone in Asia should be killed so that we can get the population back down. I remember writing about that when I was in 6th grade. That everyone in China and India should die, to solve the overpopulation problem. And that if there are poor people, the government needs to do it. If there are people who are not educated enough, it's the government needs to fix it. All right? Well, since that's how so many people view the government nowadays, now maybe not always was that case, but it's that case now, it's kind of unreasonable to assume we're going to have this idealized white nationalist state that it's going to be a free market state. It's not going to really interfere with market activity, at least within the populations it accepts. The extent that it's going to partition certain races from certain races, obviously, would be a violation of that principle. But it won't do anything else. They won't try and increase their own power. The bureaucracies won't have incentives to grow as a bureaucracy. They won't have any incentive to manipulate the populace or anything like that. All that, they're just going to be this, and I won't say utopian, but their primary interest is going to be the propagation of and race realists, and some of this point out, we don't really just care about race. We want society to be happy. We want everyone, and we just think that it needs to include this element. Okay, lots of people share that end goal. The socialists, the Democrats, the liberals, everybody pretty much, except for the people who, explicitly advocate some kind of dystopian thing, like the radical primitives or whatever, think that what they're advocating is going to be what's best for society. And again, in the knowledge problem, even if it's an insight, even if there are differences in races, and if certain races get along better than others, or within themselves, or whatever, more homogenous groups. And I think also, people mention this study. I didn't look at the study. I don't care. Happiness is a difficult thing to measure. Maybe there are neurological signals, but the components of what makes a person happy are more than just who they associate with, which is not to say that's not a part of it. I'm not asserting that. It's more than that, though. And also the way that they survey that is very difficult. Now, maybe there's some neurological test that they can administer. I don't think that there's ever, and maybe I'm wrong. If I'm wrong and this has happened, if there have been massive neurological surveys of people that have actually analyzed the brain chemistry and said, not only can we objectively prove that you are a certain metric of happy, we can also demonstrate the causation of that or the non-causation of that. We can actually show, the reason you're not happy is because there's black people in your neighborhood, or the reason that you are happy is because you're Icelandic and it's a homogeneous society. I haven't seen anything like that. If there is such a thing, let me know. I'd be interested to see it. But I think even accepting a degree of technological and scientific understanding that we don't have at this point, which is not to say we never will, but we don't have it right now, and it may not even be possible. It's not that simple because there's more than one element that goes into happiness. And again, happiness isn't the only thing that matters within society. And to just, I mean, pretty much everybody, like a lot of people think that happiness comes from everyone being egalitarian. You know, that the reason there's dissatisfaction is because we're not all the same. That's false, but like people believe that, and they advocate government policies, justify government policies, and government itself as an institution based on that assumption. And again, that's a huge logical leap. Oh, to say that everyone needs to be egalitarian, that needs some justification. To then even go further and say, and hence government is justified, more still. Just seeing what's up. We're not drilling today, but sometimes stuff happens. So, yeah, like there's a very strong tendency to latch on to some fact, and it might be a legitimate insight, and then go way too far and to think, oh, imagine that the government is going to act in a way that puts the same emphasis on that insight as you do, which of all the ideologues out there is never true. Never. I mean, even the neocons, they don't have the government that they imagine would be perfect. Listen to how they rant and rave about Obama and even Bush. Bill Kristol, like the road to Moscow leads to Tehran. Well, we haven't gone to Tehran, and we haven't gone to Moscow, and we're not being aggressive. So even for him, people. I love this. Oh, you libertarian, you anarcho-capitalist, you're advocating like this perfect, pure thing that it's just so pure and like it's just so unrealistic. But everybody has some idealized concept of how society should be. Because you can talk to any Democrat and be like, well, do we have like the ideal like democracy that you think we should? And they'll say no, and they'll say, oh, some of them might say, well, they pretty much have that in Sweden and Norway. But then those same people have no idea, like they probably couldn't even tell you the capital of those places. Name one single political party, who their heads of state, how they're organized. But they know that's the ideal system. Like it's based on a degree of ignorance that is astounding. If you go to those places, though, they often won't say we have a perfect system. They might say we think our system is better relative to others. But like nobody like. Would they say that there's perfect democracy in Sweden or perfect socialism or perfect? No. This is the Marxists kind of have this cop out for everything. Oh no. Soviet Union, that wasn't communism. No. China, communist Russia, China was not communist. Like it was capitalist or whatever. It was mixed, which is true. Like everything is mixed. That's the thing. And so it's not. This is a critique that does not apply only to like anarcho-capitalists. It basically applies to everybody because everybody who advocates for some type of system, even if it's similar to the one we have now. I mean, there's a lot of people who say, oh, you know what, the Founding Fathers pretty much got it almost exactly right, and there's just some problems with the way it is right now. Just like the guy who commented, like, oh, it's just a little corruption of the Constitution. That's all. It's the only problem is there's a little corruption with what is otherwise, optimal, if not utopian or ideal system. But even then, there's some problems with it. Well, like, could we then not say, well, why are you advocating like this perfect system? Like, again, I don't think that's a very valid argument. That's a side topic, though. So yeah, I think that the society is a very broad thing, how people interact, and various aspects of it, as useful and important and worthy of study and discussion as they are not in and of themselves, I don't think, ever sufficient justifications for extrapolating how society ought to be. So saying that we need to eat, humans have dietary, and I mean, this is why I should have brought this up earlier. Like, there are like probably some pretty basic dietary facts in terms of people's health. Whether it's paleo or Atkins or it doesn't matter. There are certain things that we can prescriptively say fairly certainly are good for people's health by and large. Not for everybody, not in all cases. And it actually varies a tremendous amount. How much sugar you can intake and before you have negative consequences is not the same for everybody. But I would venture to say that the the amount of scientific certainty that we have about the dietary results of various foods is much stronger than we have for the social results for a very kind of amorphous degree of interaction with uh, other races. And yet I don't see anyone saying we need to have an FDA paleo state that has monopoly control over food production and presentation, or at least has the institutional tools to be able to shape society to my personal satisfaction is basically what people are advocating, for dietary reasons, or for exercise reasons, or for musical reasons, or aesthetic reasons, or how much should you work and how much should you leisure, and how much, like, it's amazing how, like, Frescoian people can get when they become very, very focused on one particular aspect. And again, it's not to say that there isn't some insight there that isn't valid, that it's not interesting, that it shouldn't be discussed, but then to extrapolate, this justifies a state, that requires several more steps of logic and reasoning and argument than to just here's a fact, like high fructose corn syrup is not good for most people beyond a very small amount. Okay, fine, that doesn't justify like an FDA, and it doesn't take into the cost, like the FDA has costs in addition, like, oh yes, maybe it is protecting people from certain bad drugs, because it does. As Robert Higgs says, though, if they banned all new drugs, the chances of dying from an overdose, or dying from a complication from a new drug, at least legally, goes to zero, right? So does that make it justifiable? Is it that simple? No, it's not. No, it's not, because you're also denying potentially helpful things to people. If they ban all new drugs, then potentially life-saving or health improving or quality of life increasing drugs will also be banned. Okay, well, what's the balance? Well, if you're so simplistic as to just say, it could be bad, I'm going to bet, like, yes, interactions with black people can be bad. You can get murdered by a black person. Duh, everyone knows that. You can get murdered by a white person. Maybe the chances that you get murdered by a black person are higher or not, depends, whatever. That is not a sufficient argument to then categorically say, out the window with you people, and like it doesn't even imply how out the window. Like, is this Lincolnian where we're gonna ship them all back to Haiti or something, or like, it boggles my mind that people can reach such definite and far-reaching conclusions and cut so so imprecisely into society's makeup. I mean, I find it astonishing, and I find it most astonishing from people who have some of the libertarian insights about, look, the instrument that you're going to use if you're talking about government, it's different if you're talking about voluntary. When you divorce things from the market, when you divorce things from voluntary interaction, the incentives change dramatically. It is very different to be a company that's dependent on consenting consumers and an authority that has taxing power. Very, very, very different. Very, 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 very different. In fact, and it's not, that shouldn't even be a contentious, like, there shouldn't be any debate about that, especially if you're a libertarian. Even a non-libertarian should understand that. And the incentives that are created are not going to be in the promotion of whatever it is the topic that you're so interested in, and maybe it's justifiable that you'd be interested in or whatever, but the idea that, okay, this immensely powerful institution, the ability, an institution, especially one that is perceived to be legitimate, which I think is its most powerful attribute, it's enormous in the idea that, well, we can create this power but then wield it effectively. And I mean, I can't help but think that Tolkien was writing about the state when he wrote about the ring. It's just, it is very powerful, but its ability to create is like, it's not there. All it can do is destroy. Like, there's no, if indeed you think the state is not going to come and make the population more libertarian, it has zero incentive to ever do that. I would say this all the time in relation to public schools. If you could actually take a person, and I believe that you can actually, and make them an independent person who is able to think critically and take care of themselves, to work with enough industriousness to basically support themselves and others as well. What need have they for the government? Even, like, very little. Like, we might argue, oh, there's some free rider problems and some uh, public goods that you can't exclude people from, and you blah blah blah. Okay, very narrow. Even that, very narrow. And then the and then the extrapolation, like, well, government's justified by that very narrow thing that can't be handled by the market. Which again, I don't agree with that, but let's just assume. Oh, and then this is the government that we get, and this is the government, and like every government you have is that. We don't have any of these narrow, like, minarchist government. That these fall in line with Corsi and Milton Friedman kind of ideas about things. The things that Jim Buchanan or whatever thought that you have to solve the free rider problem because there's a couple of public goods, and I don't think defense is a public good, by the way, but like, it doesn't matter. Let's assume that it is. Oh, then we end up with this whole other thing. Well, this whole other thing, like, that all has a cost, and it's not just the tax money you pay, and it's not just the people who get their brains bashed in and murdered by the cops, or the foreigners who get killed, and then the foreigners who come back to kill us in revenge. One people like, I don't. Why do you bitch about like foreign children so much? Like, I don't care about them because they're farther removed from me. Yes, and they're closer, but those Iraqi children are closer to you than pygmy children. So shouldn't you be really upset? Like again, arbitrary line. Like, people, what's the big deal? Why is arbitrary such a big name? Because when you're going to do concrete, like, coercive actions that have very definite results, then you need to have something better than arbitrary will. Determining that. I mean, to me, it's completely capricious to do it any other way. But at the very least, so you should be worried they're going to get pissed and they're going to react against you somehow. And next thing you know, thousands of people are dead, and then the rest of us are saddled with increased police brutality, increased police state surveillance. This monolithic government that I don't even think the race realists are in favor of. I don't think. None of the ones that I interacted with, I got that impression from. They certainly never explicitly called for it. But that's what we have. I mean, so that's what they're. I mean, and if they're going to talk about, no, I don't. I favor, like, a minarchist white nationalist state. Okay. How is that going to happen? Like, how are you going to make a state that's priority is the propagation of whatever it is, egalitarianism, Marxism, liberal democratic socialism, or even Wall Street capitalism, or whatever it is, unionism or white nationalism, whatever it is. How can we assure that the state will not be primarily interested in its own aggrandizement, the advancement of its own members, and then even if we could, even if we imagine that they're angels or whatever, not necessarily angels, but their primary motivation is going to be the ends that you envision and not their own ends, which I think is a completely unrealistic assumption. But let's assume that it was. How are they going to know? How are they going to know what to do? What degree of miscegenation should be criminal? And I don't just mean miscegenation like in terms of producing offspring, but just any mixing at all. I mean, that's what America, like, my racial origins are not pure, and to an extent, like, nobody's. You can say you're from England, but, like, okay, how many generations of immigrants, like, polluted England with their Celtic and their German and their Roman, and like, a lot, and then we could go to Germany and say the same thing. Like, how many of those are actually more Eastern or Slavic or Nordic or whatever, French or Flandorian or whatever. Like, it's not like. And the thing is, that matters. If you're going to have it be about race realism, then that matters, right? I mean, that's important, and you need to. There's this really funny. It's not funny, and it's funny in a macabre sense. HBO made I think it's called The Final Solution, but Walter Bragnow was in it. Really great. It's just about the Potsdam Conference where the Nazis came up with a final solution. And there's a segment in there where they start debating, like, how do you define a Jew? And I think it was Shlomo even pointed out, and the Nazis could not actually define a Jew in a way that answered all cases on the margins. How, like, are they going to kill everybody that they can show any Jewish ancestry at all? Because that's half the country. They're all huge portion. Well, is it going to be 1/4? But does it matter if which parent it was? Does it matter how far back? Does, you know, if you have a patrilineal in a line, but all the maidens are not, like, these are important questions when you're talking about whether to put them on a train to Auschwitz or not, right? Or whether, and I'm not saying that race realists are necessarily arguing that, but like, it's a big question if you can say, your degree of association is unjustifiable in some sense, and it should be prohibited or taxed, or maybe you should pay a tariff, a misogyny tariff. Like, well, what's the tariff rate supposed to be, and how do you be sure that the tariff rate is not going to be so high that you're going to be causing deleterious effects? That it's preventing a degree of association that would be beneficial even on that. And again, you're just coming to these really, really simplistic cost-benefit analysis, like, oh, no, it's a negative externality. Well, what if I'm just, I go and I get some ivory or some rubber from Zaire, just a little bit, but I have to mix with them a little bit. Is that too much? Is that like, or is that not too much? All these questions are just glossed over in a way that I think is kind of conceited. I mean, I don't see how someone can do that. Well, I see how, because I see it all the time. I guess I'm accustomed to it, but it just, to me, it doesn't take hardly any scrutiny at all to be like, okay, wait a sec, like, and like that is not a valid conclusion based on the facts presented, and that's not a justification for a state. It's like saying, well, murder is wrong. It doesn't mean we need to have a state to take care of it. Like, people need to eat. That doesn't mean we need to have a state. Like, people need to have a way to resolve disputes. That doesn't mean you need a state. Even if we assume that we need the races not to mix, however that's defined, doesn't imply that we need a state. Certainly, and it doesn't tell us much about how that state would act. And there's nothing in that fact that provides any degree of certainty or any reassurance that that state is then going to behave that way. Because we have a long history of states that says they're going to act in ways for their own self-interest at the expense, expressly at the expense of the society that they supposedly exist to facilitate. I mean, that's what history says. That's what the empiricism of government says. Way before I started reading Murray Rothbard and all those people, I didn't know who they were. I was a history buff, and I read history books that are not written by libertarians, that don't have a libertarian agenda, that don't even kind of view the state as this alien institution of whatever. And I wouldn't call it an alien institution. It arises within human society. It's part of human society. The whole video is government natural. Yes, it is. So is shit. Shit is natural as well. It doesn't mean you bury yourself in it. Like, and I remember in my case, it was reading about the czars of Russia. Very clearly to me, the activities of the czarist regime were self-serving. And even when they did things that could plausibly be considered better for society or improvements to society, most of which were simply redactions of their own influence. Like, oh, okay, well, we had a tariff, now we're going to take it back. Okay, wow, they should get a big medal for that. But even then, it was self-serving. And a lot of people, and this is a whole other video about monarchy, people are like, oh, so the monarchs have, no, they don't. The monarchs have every incentive to take as much as they possibly can. If they're in competition with other monarchs, I think the smarter ones realize, okay, you take the hands off a little bit, but not that much, just the free-range cattle milk more, that's all. And, pretend like they're there to, be the defender of whatever your idea is, whether it's social democracy or a welfare state or race realism, is just, you're deluding yourself. I mean, you're completely deluding yourself if you believe that's the motivation of the state. And I'm not going to say it's impossible, but you need to first bring forward arguments as to how it's not going to devolve into how it always devolves, and how it's actually going to be this this institution that flies against all of its own incentives, all of its own interests, and that it's not only going to do some purified, idealized form of social intervention, but it's going to be your social intervention. You know, so like the state that you're creating, it's going to be the race realist state, and not the Marxist state, or not the social democratic state, or the worker state, or the neocon state, or the multicultural state. Like you're entering a market where like you have a lot of competition. There's a lot of people who want a powerful state that's going to do something in particular, and it's like very foolish to think I'm going to advocate for one, and then it's going to be the one that I want. It's going to be the one that reflects my will as a person. Like, how someone in the top comments, tell me how that is not delusional. Explain to me how that is not the most retarded fantasy like you could possibly, like I'm wearing a shirt Game of Thrones. That is not as fantastic as that belief. And I don't even mean, and I'll even say not even necessarily perfectly reflect, but largely or is primarily interested in reflecting like your will. How is that ever going to fucking happen? When has that ever happened in the past? The only thing that we get close to that is when the state goes and pays intellectuals and says, listen, you create an ideology that caters to whatever the fuck it is that I'm doing. And then they will. And then some people will read their stuff and be like, ah, yes, I agree, because, you know, but that's certainly not what race realists are talking about. So anyway, that's it. I'm still at work. I'll be at work in another couple weeks, but I will be done soon after that. And more videos to come. I'm be busy the next couple weeks, so I won't be able to upload any. But yep. Oh, I probably will be doing a review. I've made some additional purchases of swords, and this is never going to be a channel about reviewing swords, but I think it would be kind of fun, so I'm going to do that. I guess it goes with my red, white, and shirt. The North remembers. But yeah, like it's frustrating when I hear it from race realists who used to be libertarians, or who are still libertarians but are advocating very unlibertarian things that are not justified. I don't care if it's unlibertarian or not. I care if it's justifiable or not, or if it doesn't make any sense. If it's like a huge leap in logic, or has consequences that far outweigh any potential gain, or has no way to even gauge the costs and benefits of a scenario. You know, how important is the racial admixture in society? And if you say it's very important, fine. That is not a metric. All right? That is not a sufficient amount of information to then say, ah, you are a criminal because of the degree of your miscegenation, or you should not be allowed to do whatever, X, Y, Z, because of your racial heritage. Because just saying that it's important is not sufficient to reach those conclusions. Those are very definite. And again, you're aggregating a whole and then coming to very specific things about individual people. That itself takes a huge logical leap. Oh, you're a 21-year-old male? You must be a criminal, because statistically you're more likely to be a criminal. Like, no, you don't send someone to jail for that. All right, that would be bad. Like, they're clearly be ethically wrong, and consequentially it would be terrible. All right, and oh, you're black? Clearly black people have whatever 15 points lower on their IQ, hence you can't like get life insurance. No company in the world is gonna, if they care about money. I mean, if they look at you and like, oh, you have a bad job, blah blah blah, yeah, then they won't. They're not gonna say they look at you as an individual, though. They're not going to be like, well, on aggregate, like since most black people can't, you can't. No, and they're not going to go to some white person who's clearly a liability, who's clearly a moron, and go, oh, well, you are white after all, so you know, fine. I mean, I guess I've known too many retarded white people. I haven't known too many, but I've known more than a few high-functioning black people that just realize that's stupid. And like, again, it's fine to have a stereotype. It's fine to, okay, I meet someone I've never met before. I don't know anything about them. Sure, they're black. There's an increased chance they could be a criminal than if they're white. Sure. And you know what? Why do you think I carry one of these around wherever I go? And this is not the only thing I carry, just to think. But like, that's only until you know more, right? And then when you know more, you can make a better prescription. And the prescription might be, yeah, this person is fucking dangerous, and you know what? I am going to disassociate myself. Or it might be, this is a person that I can cooperate with. All right, but then the idea that I don't even need to know, I don't want to know, it doesn't matter. There's an aggregate of the entire population, and I can make all the conclusions I need to based on that. Come on now, people. It's just like the socialist bank. You're rich. That's all I need to know. You're not in a union. That's all I need to know. You're neocon. You're from Iraq. That's all I need to know. You're Muslim. That's the only thing I need to know. Come on, like. Yes, that all those things are valid things. All those things are important. All those things matter. All those things impart useful information. They are not everything. They don't tell you enough to reach very definite conclusions in particular cases, ever. And if you're going to create a whole system that is predicated on only recognizing the most blunt, unsophisticated analysis, then you're going to have huge consequentialist costs on the margin that are, and if you make no attempt to even calculate what those are, and I haven't seen anybody who did, and I don't think that that calculation can be done, by the way. You could try, and I think it would be easy to point out how it's wrong. But I don't even see him trying. Like I just, and to me, this just reeks of bias confirmation. Like and that's fine. People have biases, whatever. But like, don't think that your biases are binding on other people. Like, it's fine for some Zionist Israeli to believe that fucking God gave them that land. That's fine. He can believe that. Whatever. He wants to believe that. If he's going to go to some Palestinian and say, you fucking, like, have to be intermensch to me because of what, you know, what the Old Testament says, well, fuck him if he thinks anyone's going to listen to that. And I don't care if you point out, oh, Palestinians have their own issues. Yeah, of course they do as a society. That is not a justification. Like, it's not sufficient justification. No one can. If you're going to deal with aggregates and not with people, then go fuck yourself. You say people don't exist and blah blah blah. You methodological individualists. Like, well, when the rubber hits the road, on the margin, everybody's a person, and everybody's different. I mean, everyone is unique, and I know that's cliched or whatever. And I'm not saying that like everyone's a perfect snowflake or whatever, but like, we're not all the fucking same. Even within our big aggregates. I'm white. I've been to a locker room. Like, not everyone is the fucking same. Not just in this, but in here. And how they ethically react. This is going to be a big handy. Like, how they interact with people. And yes, a stereotype is fine when you don't know anything else. It's fine. It's not wrong to be that way. And it's not wrong to be aware of the aggregates. Absolutely, it's not. And it's not wrong to study the aggregates or talk about them. But it's stupid to substitute generic information in lieu of specific information when it is available, which it is if we are talking about an insurance policy, a tenant, an employee, a coworker, a spouse. Then specific information is available, and it is superior. It is superior to aggregations of a whole population in those situations. So, wasn't going to make this a rant against race realism if if it has government implications. If it doesn't, I really don't. I agree. I'm a race realist in that sense. Like, don't emphasize myself in that way, but you know, I can't deny. I don't think that everyone's the same, and there are definitely differences between groups, and that's fine. Anyway, 53-minute video. I'm sorry, everybody, if you watched the whole thing. Like, salute to you, and I don't know, I'll talk to you all later.